Think of many series through the book of Ezekiel, and the reason for it would be that there's just so much material in it, and the scope of which is very, very wide. But let me say a couple things in introduction to the book. First of all, that it is addressed to Ezekiel, who had been a prophet at a time when he would be a contemporary both of Daniel and Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah would have, of course, he would have been early on in the time of Ezekiel, and Daniel, of course, later, or would have been in the first captivity. So Ezekiel would have been later. There's quite a bit known about Ezekiel, but no one really knows a whole lot about where he's buried. Some people think he's buried in Baghdad, actually, and he would have been a part of the second leading away, and a couple years later than the first group of captives that would have come out of Babylon. Ezekiel would have been the son of a priest, and so he would have had different qualifications than some of the prophets. His calling would have been one that would be natural, and it would appear from reading and studying the book of Ezekiel that he had some respectability with the people, and we find that he, in many cases, wasn't treated the way that Jeremiah would have been treated, or the way, even in some senses, as far as his reception as a prophet, when it would have been even in contrast to that of Daniel. And so it would have been a standalone in his day. We find an introduction to him in Ezekiel chapter 1, and we think that probably this would be written around 595 BC, so around 600 years before Christ, and it would be a large amount of the material in the book, really all the material in the book, deals with Israel, her captivity, and her rebellion. And so we're going to there are some major themes, and let me just point them out to you. I don't know that you could maybe necessarily take notes on it, but some major themes that are in the book of Ezekiel that would be kind of standalone. First of all, the theme of Ezekiel as a watchman, and we'll see that this evening, but it is certainly not a small one, not a small theme. It's a major underlying theme throughout the book of Ezekiel, and his calling to be the messenger of God regardless of reception, regardless of consequences, and the necessity of warning those individuals to whom he's called. And that's really one of the things that we'll look at this evening. We see in Ezekiel, though, a lot of different topics. For instance, in chapters 4 through 7 was the siege of Jerusalem, and this is literally a time of captivity, and it would be, I believe, 390 years that he was supposed to, 390 days he's supposed to lay on his side and lay siege against this city, and this would be to demonstrate to the people of Israel that God was against Israel, and then 40 days against Jerusalem, and those would appear to be a parallel in the captivity to the captivity of the children of Israel in Egypt. And certainly there's a lot to that you could look at, but the idea of it is that God has had his hand of judgment against Israel even while in captivity. And so one of the things that I want to emphasize is, before we even get into the text this evening, that this is a book to God's people who are not living the way that they want to. They are in captivity. One of the things that astonishes me many times, but also helps me to understand God and his nature, is how that somebody who is in the kind of situation that Israel would have been in the captivity, could continue in their rebellion against Israel. And one of the visions that God takes Ezekiel in, he takes him into a secret place and tells him to cut a hole away in the wall, and there's a door that opens up. And here he finds the leaders of Jerusalem worshiping other gods in secret. And you find that even Israel, who is in captivity and having the consequences of her sins, is still worshiping the devil, if you will. And boy, how deep-rooted is rebellion, and how much rebellion is like witchcraft. And I think that probably just as much as the book of Revelation helps me to understand rebels, the book of Ezekiel does as well. You have a hard time, as I do, understanding the rebellious. Many times in my heart, I just think, well, they just don't understand. You ever thought about a rebel? Well, he just doesn't get it. That's my real-life experience with rebels. Usually a rebel will trick me because I just think that they just don't understand. And I'll try to make concessions to them and try to help them with something, and I ultimately find out, you know what? That individual's rebellious all the way through. There's no concession that can help him to understand. There's nothing you can do to turn their heart because they're rebellious. And that's one of the themes that you'll find in the book of Ezekiel, is the rebellion that in spite of God's long-suffering and in spite of their punishment, they will not submit. And God understands that. God knows that that's the case of them, but it's not everyone, and I want to point that out as well. Not everybody in Israel is included in that category. We'll see that this evening. There's the apparent fall of David's throne. That is included. It's in chapter 19, and of course that's a pretty major theme in the book of Ezekiel, but we know particularly if you look at, I believe it's, Jeremiah 43:6, how that God preserved the line of David through the royal princesses instead of through the men, even though Ezekiel's sons would have been killed. There's the parable of Israel and Judah's unfaithfulness through Aholiah and Aholibah. Always good names to name your son or daughter. And you never forget that one. This is my good friend Aholibah and his brother Aholibah. They were ladies, weren't they, Aholibah? I can't remember. Anyway, good names. Prophecies against Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. And so God, of course, judges the wicked. God's not an unjust God. You ever wonder, isn't it worse to be a child of God's because of chastisement than it is to just be allowed to live how you want to? I remember as a kid having to come to an understanding about children whose parents didn't do anything about making them do right. And it seemed as though they enjoyed great freedom and great happiness as a result of that freedom. And I've since realized that that wasn't freedom at all, and that indeed those individuals, though they may have been allowed things that I wasn't allowed, had consequences much worse than I had as a child of my parents. And so we see that theme in the book, in this book, and how that God doesn't just prophesy against his people Israel, but that he judges all men. Again, the theme in the Bible that I've found, and I'd like to point out a lot of times, is that God is the God of all living. Many individuals think that simply by their rejecting God as their God and saying, well, he may be your God, but he's not mine, that they reject him as a God, the eternal judge and ruler of the world. And the fact is, he is the eternal judge and ruler of the world, and he'll judge them someday whether they acknowledge him or not. The day will come that they will acknowledge him, but it'll be the day of judgment, and it perhaps will not be before that. And that's a good reminder to us, Christian. It's a good reminder that God is a righteous judge, and that there's no one who escapes his judgment. And so there's a lot of ramifications of that. One of those being that it's important for us to preach Jesus Christ to the lost so that they don't have to be part of that judgment. And also so that, as we'll see this evening, even from our introduction to our text, that we'll be guiltless ourselves. Then, of course, the prophecies about Egypt, and then the valley of the dry bones. This is probably one of the passages of Scripture, the Valley of Dry Bones, that helps me understand contemporary Israel today better than anything else. And I think we'll draw some conclusions there about the nation of Israel that will, in your mind, exalt God more and probably put in its place the place of current day events in your life. By the way, I make so many statements sometimes because of the extremes on one side that perhaps I seem like an extreme on the other hand. And many times I make a statement that I don't make too much out of current events. And the reason I say that is because current events have always been current, and things have always looked up. Things have always looked as though the coming of Jesus was going to be shortly. And so by saying today that I don't want to overemphasize current events, the only reason I say that is not to say that things don't look up more than they ever have. But it's to say that the events is not what orchestrates the happenings of the world. It is God in heaven who knows a time that no man knows, and who has set a date that no man is aware of and cannot realize. And we certainly may know the signs of the times, but the signs of the times, if we were to say that today the signs of the time are different than they were in any other generation, in other words, they look more like it today than in any other generation, I think that it is a disrespect to generations before us to whom God has commanded to love his coming. God's people have always been commanded to look for his coming. And that has been no less to those generations past, no less important than it is to us ourselves, to we ourselves. By the way, that's one of the issues in this current Sunday school series that we're looking at, the version debate, why we use the King James Version in the Scripture. And I think that it's important for us to realize that for us today to assume that we've come up with a